Right, we'll get started. So good afternoon. I'm Nicola Kettlewood. I'm the manager of Film Hub Scotland. And this is the first of our EDI Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in Focus sessions run on behalf of BFI FAN. So we're running a couple of these sessions each year. I'm working on this project with our consultant, Charlie Little, who's joining us this afternoon for a presentation about advocacy for using descriptive subtitles. We have Gail here from Just Sign, who is delivering closed captions. So if you need them, please do enable that. That should be working now. Okay, Charlie, so off you go. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thanks so much. I'll just let Nicola share my PowerPoint slides, but thank you all so much for joining me today. As Nicola said, my name is Charlie Little, in-house access consultant at Matchbox Cinesub, and I'm Film Hub Scotland's EDI champion, supporting the FAN membership to develop engagement with deaf and disabled audiences. For myself, I'm hard of hearing and partially sighted, and I very much bring that lived experience as a moviegoer with access needs to my work as a consultant. And I just thought I would mention as a point of clarity, I use descriptive subtitles due to my hearing, but because of the type of sight loss I have, I don't use audio description. I'm very much a self-confessed subtitles enthusiast, and I'm really excited to be talking today to discuss how exhibitors can truly advocate for standardized, accessible screenings. This session does focus on descriptive subtitles, but some of the learnings from this session can very much be applied much more widely across other access provisions as a general stance towards accessible film exhibition. Onto the agenda for today. Throughout the session, I'll be discussing the different approaches and tools that you can utilize to create a default of accessible screenings and to help empower exhibitors to be strong in their approach. I'll also mention examples of exhibitors across the UK, but I will note now that a lot of the references I make are Scottish based, partly because I'm myself based in Scotland. So I'll mention exhibitors who regularly or only screen descriptive subtitled or DS screenings. We'll start by looking at terminology, and then I'll discuss the significance of high quality and consistent DS screening. I'll talk about the current landscape and provision of these screenings and talk about the different attitudes towards DS, and I'll have information on statistics and key pointers for audience development. The concept for the webinar was very much inspired by my colleague at Matchbox Cinesub, Sean Welsh, who's the subtitler and programmer, and our general approach to advocate for access, not apologize for it. I really hope that this information provided during the session will help exhibitors better understand the current landscape, provision and attitudes, and kind of help you learn statistics and arguments that can support you in feeling more confident in advocating for DS screenings. So the next slide, I'm going to talk about what actually are descriptive subtitles. Maybe some of you haven't heard of this term before. So descriptive subtitles, or DS, they transcribe dialogue as well as providing descriptions of the relevant and significant aspects of a film's soundtrack. So sound effects and music. It would have speaker labels. An example might be brackets, kettle whistling, door slamming, or providing speaker labels as to who is actually speaking that dialogue. Descriptive subtitles can also be known as HOH, hard of hearing, SDH, subtitles for deaf and hard of hearing, and captions or subtitles. I think there's because there's a variety of terms used by both audiences and industry professionals, this itself can lead to confusion and misunderstandings about what exactly is being provided. If it's accessible subtitles that's being provided that are accessible for deaf and hard of hearing people, or if it's just English language subtitles, and I'll get into that a little bit more. There can also be confusions about what the actual format of the files are, such as you might have heard of C caps and O caps. Again, I'll get into that a little bit more. I think the term captions would traditionally refer to CC or closed captions, which in a nutshell is a subtitle track that you can turn on or off. So when I'm going on Netflix, those are closed captions because I have the ability to turn them on or off. Open captions are captions that you can't turn off. So a cinema screening with captions would be open captioned. To call a cinema screening CC'd or showing with closed captions is, it's incorrect on a technicality. And in terms of on a technical level, making sure that you're receiving O caps, so open captions, rather than C caps, closed captions, when you're receiving DCPs, because these are formatted differently, especially if you're receiving DCPs from the US. You might have heard of many US cinemas having little tablets that they might give to people, which shows the captions rather than having captions on the cinema screen. So those would be closed captions. So the term captions used to refer to a full transcription, the definition I just provided for descriptive subtitles. But now the term caption seems to be very much used interchangeably by people to refer to just dialogue subtitles. So subtitles that are just the dialogue rather than the soundtrack. English language subtitles that you would see at, say a recent screening of Zone of Interest, which is German and Polish dialogue. That's providing a translation, whereas descriptive subtitles would provide a transcription of the entire soundtrack, as well as including any relevant translation subtitles. Descriptive subtitles have much more complexities and nuances, and so that's the main difference between descriptive subtitles and English language subtitles. And it's very important to understand the difference and also be able to communicate the difference to audiences, especially audiences with access needs or audiences that are deaf and hard of hearing and would perhaps require full description, so full descriptive subtitles. This term has become much more widely used now, and many exhibitors are using the term descriptive subtitles, including Watershed. Festivals such as Take One Action in Scotland has also adopted the term, and Matchbox very much advocate for this term, and BFI are also starting to use it. And the UKCA just recently released audience guidance, which mentions this term as well. I think the thing about this term is that there's a clear distinction between English language subtitles and descriptive subtitles, as it says it does what it says on the tin. I also like that it doesn't label the intended audience like SDH and HOH does. We don't feel the need to say that this provision is for deaf and hard of hearing. Just like we don't necessarily say AD, audio description, for blind and partially sighted people. As I'll get into later, there's so many people, regardless of their hearing, that require or prefer descriptive subtitles. I had a few examples where I spoke to hearing people who felt like they couldn't attend what was labeled as a SDH screening because they thought it was only for deaf and hard of hearing people and they didn't want to, invade that space. So I think using consistent and easily understood language and terms around access materials leaves less room for mistakes or misunderstandings, especially when communicating with both audiences and distributors. I've had a few personal examples of staff at cinemas telling me that a screening was accessible to me because it was English language subtitled, when I myself, because of my hearing, would need to attend a descriptive subtitle screening. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. If anyone has any questions at this point, because I know it's, yeah, I've just thrown a lot. I would love to hear any questions at the moment before I move on. I just thought I would begin with terminology because, like I say, I think just having that as a foundation just leaves less room for mistakes, and it's something that you can consider when you're communicating to audiences and perhaps make a change in the language that you're using around access needs. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A option, and Nicola can read them out for me.
And Charlie, what within the deaf and hard of hearing communities, is there any research about how much people know the term descriptive subtitles and are comfortable with it?
Yeah, so I think in terms of research, I haven't come across any specific research, but I know that with, say, Watershed, for example, the term descriptive subtitles was talked about with the deaf artist and activist David Ellington. But the term, that's the thing, like more and more people have to use it in order for it to be more recognized. And I think it will take time, but like I say, it's becoming more and more adopted. And I think as long as people are consistent, then people will catch on, both audiences and distributors. So there's not been that much research, but I think that would be a really interesting thing to look into to see how people respond to it. But I know that from personal communications with other deaf people, in terms of not being labeled, that is quite important, and especially for people who aren't deaf, also not being labeled. If there's not any more questions, I can I'll move on to the next section. And there is time at the end for questions as well. If you think of anything, just feel free to put them in the Q&A function. So I wanted to talk about next the value of putting on regular descriptive subtitle screenings. Aside from funding criteria and diversity standards that need to be met, perhaps, there is, as we know, an overarching responsibility and need for the exhibition sector to be welcoming audiences who have been historically underserved. Films, I think our mutual goal is that we want as many people as possible to experience cinema, not to be cheesy, but and film should have the opportunity to reach the widest audience possible. And of course, that includes deaf people and those with access needs. Ever since the silent film era ended and the talkies came along, deaf and hard of hearing people have been excluded from the equal opportunity to experience movies until recent times. High quality descriptive subtitles, they're made to enhance the film, not to distract audiences from it. And they're there to create as equal an experience as possible. I think consistency and reliability, that's what helps to build audiences. And I think also having an approach of holistic access and outreach as well. As we know, descriptive subtitles used by many people, including some neurodivergent people who prefer DS and people perhaps whose first language isn't English. There's also audiences who struggle with audio processing who benefit from DS. Accessibility as a whole has to be treated as a default rather than being dependent on an uptake basis. The idea is that it should always be available, rather than waiting for someone to access and to request it and then being made available. And I think that's the integral purpose of the concept of accessibility. The onus, in an ideal world, the onus shouldn't be on audiences building the trust in exhibitors, especially if they're marginalized audiences. It should be exhibitors working to build the trust of those audiences that have been underserved. Accessible screenings have to go beyond the physicality of just playing a film with descriptive subtitles. We also have to think about the audience journey. Say you're advertising a title that you're going to screen on social media, and you're sharing trailers that don't have descriptive subtitles, then of course it's difficult to engage audiences to seek out your accessible screenings. If your website doesn't have access information, maybe in relation to deaf audiences, that might be a hearing loop, then it's difficult to engage and welcome those audiences. If your staff hasn't had accessibility or disability training, then it's likely that audiences with access needs won't feel welcomed and they won't return. Every time I attend the cinema, I always double check with the usher or staff member that the film is playing with captions, because I've had experiences where it's advertised as captioned and it's not played with captions. And most of the time, the staff aren't sure and they have to go and ask a bunch of people to double check. And sometimes, or maybe most of the time, they're not deaf aware either. And that can be quite uncomfortable and daunting for many people who have access needs as well. I think ensuring that there's high quality, comfortable experiences that will support your audiences to regularly return. And hence, consistency being able to support building audiences. In the next slide,
there's a question.
Yeah, sure.
On that question really about how you communicate with your audiences.
Mhm.
Someone's said, we use caption screenings at the moment in our cinema. Would you recommend adding the definition of descriptive subtitles to listings or possibly to an access page just until it is more well known?
Oh yes, absolutely. And exactly, like people are still learning the term, so I think it's important to have that definition and having it on your listings and on your dedicated access webpage. Absolutely, I definitely encourage doing that.
Great. And someone else also asked, how would you define being deaf aware, and what can exhibitors do to ensure they're being deaf aware?
So I think seeking out training from a certified deaf awareness provider in order to help your staff understand deaf awareness. They can do, day sessions that might be learning basic British Sign Language, that might be learning things like how to communicate with people that are hard of hearing. So yeah, and at the end I'll talk about resources, but yeah, definitely seeking out deafness awareness training from a provider.
Thank you.
Is there any more?
That's everything just now.
Okay, cool. So on the next slide, I wanted to talk a bit about the current provision of descriptive subtitle screenings. So back in the early 2010s, I think it was 2011, Netflix, they lost a lawsuit, which meant that they had to make sure that all of their content was provided with closed captions within the next 2 years. And a few years later, here we are now, and closed captions are very commonly used by the mainstream population to watch films, to watch television, and social media videos. And now many other streaming services provide a degree of descriptive subtitles for their content. The quality and consistency does vary and it does fluctuate, but overall, there's still been a very steady progression in the provision of captions. I'll call them captions right now, in terms of streaming and online content. So audiences, they can prefer subtitles for a huge range of reasons outside of hearing loss, such as improved concentration, better appreciation of the soundtrack, and perhaps difficulties understanding some accents. I remember with Tenet, Christopher Nolan's Tenet, people complained that the film should have been shown with subtitles because those arguably poor sound editing. I do want to say, while I talk about the positives of descriptive subtitle screening, it is important to note that there can be some audiences who genuinely can't watch films with subtitles. Some neurodiverse people, some people with dyslexia say that they struggle with them. And access needs, they can conflict with each other, and this is an example of that. And there's no blanket approach. There's no, I can't give a yes or no answer to something like this, but I think one way of handling this is if you are screening multiple screenings of the same film, you can provide equal opportunities for people to attend a DS screening or not. So the theater subtitling company StageText did a research case where they reported that 4 out of 5 viewers aged 18 to 25 said that they use subtitles either all of the time or partially. And the charity's research also implied that an average of 31% of people would go to more live events and shows if there was more captions. And among 18 to 25-year-olds, that figure was 45%. There's not a ton of data in relation to the independent sector. And I do have some data that refers to multiplexes, but in terms of Netflix, they report that 40% of viewers use their closed caption now. At the end of 2022, BBC Newsround did a report, and a young deaf film fan, he recorded a week's worth of descriptive subtitle screenings for Marvel's Black Adam. And out of 3 major cinemas, View had 30 screenings, only 1 had descriptive subtitles. Out of Cineworld's 64, 2 were descriptive subtitles, and Odeon had 76 and 2 descriptive subtitle screenings, so less than 1%. And of course, none of those were at the weekend. So the data isn't very well tracked, and maybe you've heard of some accessible screenings listing websites or databases such as Your Local Cinema and the UKCA's Accessible Screenings UK website. They include screenings for both descriptive subtitles and English language subtitle screenings, but they're completed in the same category. So the information isn't very well tracked, and there's not been any released data on this yet. But I think even if you go and look at your individual cinemas, you'll be able to tell that there's still a very much low provision, and the cinema provision of DS screenings doesn't reflect current audience demand that we see in streaming. Another thing is that people might not make the adjustment from subtitles on a small screen to the big screen, and the issue of quality of descriptive subtitles can also come into play. Does anyone have any questions about that so far?
There is a little question in the, maybe we want to return to at the end. There's a question in the chat just about the difference between AD and DS, which is quite it's a small question, but it's actually quite a big answer, I suspect. So we might just go back, look back to that at the end.
Yeah, I can look back at the end for sure. But just to briefly explain, DS would be for people with hearing loss. It would be text on a screen, and AD would be intended for blind people, so it would be audible commentary, but I'll do a fuller description at the end. So in the next slide, we'll see this wonderful moment from the Oscars a few years ago. It was the only time I ever stayed up to watch the full Oscars, and it was very much worth it to see Parasite win. But when Parasite's director, Bong Joon-ho, did his speech, he said the very famous quote now, "Once you overcome the 1-inch tall barrier of subtitles, you will be introduced to so many more amazing films." And of course, he is referring to English language subtitles, but I would like to apply that more widely to descriptive subtitles. And I just, yeah, hearing that was just an amazing moment. And I think we can say that since Parasite, big win, and shows like Squid Game, and other international language films during this awards season, has very much encouraged more mainstream audiences to engage with and watch subtitled films. And I know that these are language subtitles, and these act as a translation for those that can't access the language. And I feel like when I do come across, in the next slide, I feel like when we do come across hostility towards descriptive subtitles, it can sometimes come from a place where it's seen as an inconvenience to people who don't need that access. But when those same audiences are experiencing a lack of access because of a language barrier, text on a screen is no problem. It's useful. This year alone, we've got 3 major films in I can't remember, sorry, they might not all be Best Picture nominated, I can't remember. But Anatomy of a Fall, Past Lives, The Zone of Interest, all feature language subtitles. So just seeing that increase in people's engagement with language subtitles. I think some, in terms of attitudes, some exhibitors and hearing audiences view descriptive subtitles as a visual nuisance, as an intrusion. And like I say before, when there's a lack of access because of language, then some of these same people are completely okay with subtitles on the screen. So you might have heard of some audiences complaining about the descriptions within descriptive subtitles because they don't need to access that, but perhaps they struggle with understanding dialogue. So the dialogue subtitle aspect of descriptive subtitles is useful for them. One example I like to talk about is the franchise A Quiet Place, which, if you don't know, very much features a deaf character. It features sign language, and deafness is a very significant part of that franchise, especially in the first 2 films. But when those films came out, there was hardly any accessible screenings, and there was a lack of accessible marketing. So many videos and trailers released without descriptive subtitles, yet the same marginalized identities are used within those films without providing access for them. And so we're starting to see aesthetics being prioritized over access, where access provisions are starting to be tailored to suit the comfort of those who don't necessarily need them. Some people seem more focused on minimizing the visual intrusion, rather than providing high quality, full access provisions. Even Netflix had started reducing the amount of descriptive labels in their trailers, almost down to just dialogue subtitles. And some of the trailers now use aesthetic fonts rather than default fonts, which is almost to make it more pretty. And it can cause access issues themselves. Sometimes they're just not readable. So I would say that low quality descriptive subtitles isn't an access provision, and it can dampen or even negate the whole point and experience of it. And it can also fuel negative feelings towards descriptive subtitles. I think overall, more and more distributors are very much engaging with access materials, but there's still a very long way to go. Does anyone have any questions on that? Yeah, I've seen one popped up, that's all.
There was a question about the name of the UK databases providing accessible screening listings. And I know you're going to cover some resources at the end.
Yeah, I'll go over that later on. Yeah, so in terms of current attitudes, it is overall improving in terms of audience reactions, but there are still some that, in terms of distributors and some exhibitors and audiences that are a bit more focused on minimizing the presence or the boldness of descriptive subtitles and making it as aesthetic as possible. So I think that's something to be aware of. And I think descriptive subtitles, to be truly accessible, it has to be high quality, it has to be accessible to those who need it. And when the comfort of those who don't need access are prioritized over those who actually do need it, then obviously that's negating the whole point. But I think it's been really wonderful to see films like Coda and even A Quiet Place and Sound of Metal generating more conversations about deaf talent and therefore access for those same audiences. And we are seeing an uptick in general. It's just, there's still a long way to go. I'll just take a water break before we go into the next slide. I wanted to talk a bit about examples of exhibitors. So I was very lucky to grow up in Aberdeen. I'm going to finish that sentence. I was very much lucky to grow up in Aberdeen because I had Belmont Film House, and Aberdeen's in the northeast of Scotland. And Belmont Film House was the sister cinema to Edinburgh Film House. And they were the only independent cinema in Aberdeen, and they were the only ones that really engaged with access and had regular, reliable, accessible screenings. And throughout university, I could go to multiple screenings throughout the week, whereas with multiplexes, I would maybe be able to catch the one subtitled screening within a 2-week run and have to reorganize my whole plans around that. And I think just having that comfort and knowing that the staff truly engaged with access was really wonderful. And I moved to Edinburgh, and I had Edinburgh Film House, who again also really engaged with the frequency of accessible screenings, and I was able to go quite regularly as well. And I never had problems where I turned up, it was advertised as DS and it played without, whereas I had that problem all the time with multiplexes. So that built trust, that built comfort, that meant that I could go along and not be stressed, which I don't think any of us want to be stressed when we're going to the cinema. So that was hugely important to me. And when those two cinemas unfortunately closed, I very much felt the void. Even living in Edinburgh, where there's so many cinemas, I still feel the void. But there's exhibitors such as Watershed and Glasgow Film Theatre who provide very regular, reliable, accessible screening. There's also exhibitors such as Showroom who do a day dedicated to descriptive subtitle screenings, and film festivals such as even Matchbox's own festivals, including Weird Weekend, Take One Action Film Festival, Scottish Queer International Film Festival. They present all of their screenings with descriptive subtitles, and that has become a standard practice now. That's an expectation, which is really amazing. And know that when I hear that their program's being released, I'm going to be able to attend all of it. But sometimes when other festivals are being released, they still haven't released their accessible screenings. There's a few films, a few premieres that I won't be able to attend because there's not descriptive subtitles, and that can be a case of just access the file, which is a whole other conversation to go into. But I think just knowing that a festival is going to be fully accessible for me, that is a very unusual experience for me. So in terms of case studies, Film Hub Scotland did one recently with 2 Scottish community cinemas who started to screen their films with descriptive subtitles. So the first one is called Film Forest, and they had started receiving audience feedback to show the films with DS because many of their audiences had hearing loss, and there was also audiences whose first language wasn't English. So they put up a flip chart as a survey to kind of gauge the response as to what would happen if they did start doing that, and the majority did ask for them. And so a few months later, they decided to trial it because some people had just stopped turning up because the sound was quite poor, and they weren't able to enjoy the experience. One very important thing that they did was that they made that change very clear on their marketing, advertising, and their communications about what they were doing. And they said that there wasn't any adverse criticism, and most people were relieved to be able to understand the dialogue. And the audiences that they lost, they came back and they have said, quote, "It's been a huge success." The next community cinema is Cinema Nairn, and they introduced descriptive subtitles, and they were unsure as to what the response would be from the regulars. And there was 2 main reasons why they wanted to introduce them, because the clarity of the dialogue was quite poor, so poor sound editing in some of the films. And I think, it was always on a week-to-week basis, a bit of uncertainty about how good the sound acoustics would be. And so they did, a hands up question in their introduction to see how people would respond. And then they started to trial it. And again, they also communicated this on their website, but they didn't communicate this in their emails. They said that the initial reaction was somewhat neutral, but some did say that the subtitles enhanced their enjoyment. And their attendance has increased, but they're not sure if this is maybe because of COVID. And they're still providing descriptive subtitle screenings. They've had people approach them to say how useful they were, and some of them say that they use subtitles all the time at home while watching TV. I would say that something to note in terms of those 2 case studies is the element of surveying and voting. I would say if you're an exhibitor that wants to look at this, I would very much ask you to consider anonymous methods or non-public methods of voting. If you're an audience member that would want DS, it's a very self-conscious position to be in if you're having to watch other people criticize your access needs. This was something that happened to me a lot with a child in school, and it's a very, very self-conscious and deeply affecting position to be in. So I would just say that that's something I would advise, is making sure that if you're surveying or voting, that it's done in a much more delicate way, and that if you're communicating change, it's across the board, like all of your communication, and that leaves no room for people to say, oh, but I didn't know. I think another point that was brought up in the case study was descriptive subtitles and dialogue subtitles. And you know, there was it was noticeable that people didn't mind subtitles when they showed them not in the English language subtitles, but they were showing films in the English language with the dialogue subtitles, not the descriptive subtitles, and they noted that they should reconsider this because especially they want to encourage people with hearing loss to be included in the community cinema. So yeah, those are main case studies and exhibitors that you can look at and perhaps look at their communication methods, what they have on their website. If you're planning on doing much more increased screenings or wanting to do all of your screenings with descriptive subtitles. In the next slide, talk a bit more about the actual actions of advocating and not apologizing for an access provision. I think ensuring that your team or your staff, they feel confident and comfortable explaining descriptive subtitles, their definitions, but also why you're wanting to provide descriptive subtitles, but also taking the fact that, like it or leave it, really, that you're not going to be persuaded against having them. I think also having clear and consistent communication, like I've just mentioned with the case studies, if you're communicating any changes. And also remember that if people are providing feedback, making sure to understand exactly what they're saying in their feedback. If they're criticizing the quality of the descriptive subtitles, not conflating that with audiences not wanting descriptive subtitle screenings at all. That's a whole different matter. I think another thing is the way that you're scheduling your accessible screenings, not putting them on one day or one specific time of the day. It very much limits its potential to reach wider audiences and people work. I understand you might need to trial it, but if you can have a variance of schedule screening, that is going to be how you build your audiences. By audience development and by context, very much relating to your expectations. Understand that if you put on a descriptive subtitle screening, you're not going to have every deaf person in your local area be there the minute that you do it, and you have to take time and care, as all audience development should take. But think about your local population of deaf people, how big your cinema screens are anyways, and thinking about holistic issues such as deaf awareness. I think having meaningful outreach with local deaf and hard of hearing groups and talking to them about your plans to improve access and perhaps even working with them on that. And also at the same time, not just thinking that descriptive subtitles are only for deaf and hard of hearing people. The accessible screenings that have been able to attend at multiplex cinemas have often been full of stress. Many occasions where the film would start playing without descriptive subtitles, and the staff would struggle to resolve the issue, and therefore they would continue the screening without descriptive subtitles, and I would have to leave, even though it's advertised and accessible showing. I would get offered a refund, but of course, my journey there wasn't considered. It was perhaps the only one that was scheduled. And of course, I lost trust. I didn't go back. And it's a really deflating experience. And there's other times where I've been to screenings and the audience member perhaps didn't realize it was an accessible screening. It would be advertised as one, but again, perhaps it's not clear enough or it's not across the board. Complaints would be made. And the staff wouldn't know how to handle it. And it's a really horrible, thinking feeling to be in when customers are demanding that your film should be played in an accessible way, and staff aren't given the tools or training to handle these situations. There has to be ultimately a collective and collaborative effort towards standardized uniform provision, but don't bite off more than you can chew, and build it and take a clear, firm stance with it. I think also another point to make is that if you're having accessible screenings that have live elements, so a Q&A perhaps, thinking about provisions such as live captioning, and perhaps if you want to engage deaf audiences, BSL as well. But also remember that not every deaf person uses BSL. So I don't use BSL, so I would benefit from live captions. I think in terms of, if there are complaints, just taking that strong stance and not ever apologizing for it. So the next slide, I mentioned Sidecard, which is it was a joint initiative of Matchbox, Film Hub Scotland, Film Hub Wales, and ICO, Independent Cinema Office. It's an online database that catalogs details about access materials, so including descriptive subtitles. So it makes it easier for people to find out if the title has these files and who to contact for these files, so they can potentially use it for accessible screening. You can log information or you can search information. And the more and more people engage with it, of course, the database will grow. So, please do check out Sidecard, and it's ran by Matchbox Cinesub. So do get in touch if you have any questions about that. And we also have more information on there about the term descriptive subtitles, and we have a bunch of how-to guides for exhibitors and venues. But yeah, I think that's all I have time for today in terms of my presentation. But in my final slide, I just wanted to mention before I open up for questions that I've been working on an access directory, which is a document that collates a vast collection and spectrum of external resources and information guides and toolkits related to accessible film exhibition in general, but a section on descriptive subtitles. It's still in the very final stages, but it will be shared across the fan hub soon, so do keep an eye out for that. Does anyone have any questions about what I've talked about today?
There's quite a few questions in the...
Okay, that's great.
So we've had a question: what are the best practices to cater towards all people through marketing communications for films and film festivals that you could recommend? And similarly, there was a question: are there any websites for accessible screenings listings that festivals can use to promote their screenings, or are the websites available mostly for venues and cinemas?
Oh, big questions. The first one, so what are best practices to cater towards all people through marketing communication?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of social media and emails, I think in the directory, there is actually going to be a section on accessible communications, if that's what you're referring to. And that will be available very soon. Sorry, it's a very big question, and there's a lot of different branches to it, but I would say that in this directory, this basically covers what you're asking. So yeah, sorry, I can't answer that right now, but there'll be this section that you can refer to, which will answer your question, if that's okay, because that's a whole other session in itself. The second question is sources for obtaining high quality descriptive subtitles for existing titles.
So the question is, do you know good sources for obtaining high quality descriptive subtitles for existing titles, and sources for affordably commissioning descriptive subtitles for those that don't have any made yet? So obviously, sidecard, as you've mentioned, is if someone has already, if you have run a festival or if you run a venue and you've already had captions made, then please do make sure you've listed them on sidecard. That's free to do. It's quite an easy process.
Absolutely.
And
And on sidecard, there is a list of providers that specialize in producing descriptive subtitles. So that includes Matchbox Cine, Date for Night, Screen Language. So I think in the chat or somewhere we'll put the link for sidecard. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
And then you kind of touched upon this in your presentation. Someone's asked, I know BSL is a language in its own right, but if I'm unable to secure a BSL interpreter, is a live captionist for a discussion after a screening a suitable alternative?
So I would say that BSL and live captions aren't interchangeable and that they're different access needs. So I wouldn't see it as a replacement, but if in terms of BSL interpreter, you should still go with having a live captioner, but not thinking that one replaces the other. I would say with securing BSL interpreters, having plenty of time in advance, that is one way of making sure that you'll have BSL interpretation. Funding or your budget might be a different question, but yeah, I would say that it's not an alternative because it's not interchangeable, but it will still support some audiences with access needs in terms of their hearing. Some BSL users also use live captions. I hope that answers your question. Was there any other questions, Nicola?
I'm muting myself, sorry. So that's all the questions here, I think.
Okay.
There was, someone did ask, sorry, just to go back a little bit in the chat, someone asked, could film festivals providing descriptive subtitles for all screenings conflict with the preference of other audiences? E.g., you'd mentioned some neurodiverse people have a preference for no subtitles. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, of course. This is a difficult one because there's not a blanket answer approach. I think, and that's where like communicating what access provisions you're providing is important. And do remember that there's still not very many exhibitors that only screen entirely descriptive subtitle screenings, but I think depending on what your capacity is or what, the range of accessible screenings and events you have, that's something that you have to think about in terms of the audiences that you are trying to develop or engage with. And like I say, if you're doing multiple screenings of the same title, then you can, if you want to make sure that all access needs are accommodated for, then you can have non-descriptive and descriptive scheduled showings. It's a bit more difficult if you're only doing one screening of one per title. Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have an answer for that. It very depends on your circumstances and your capacity as well. So it's very much a case-by-case basis, I say, like there's not a blanket approach, but it's something that's in development. It's something that's still being talked about and worked through. And even things like having online screenings, that's one way of, if you can provide closed captions, so where you can turn them on or off, that's one way of being able to accommodate audiences who need or don't need descriptive subtitles.
Thanks, Charlie. And I imagine, as you mentioned before, communication with your audience, just being clear about what's accessible and maybe who the target audience is. There's a question about, I know you talked about trailers before, At the moment, I don't think distributors provide descriptive subtitles for trailers. And do you know if this is changing?
Yeah, I mean, it's always it's funny because when I've taken friends to descriptive subtitle screening, then we sit down, we're there during the adverts, and they go, they're not playing with, we need to go talk to the staff, they're not playing with descriptive subtitles. And I say, this is normal. This is normal. Yeah, it's unfortunate. That's another gap within the sector, that trailers aren't delivered to cinemas with descriptive subtitles or audio description. Oh, I'll get back to that question actually after I answer that. But in terms of online, on social media, when trailers are dropped on platforms such as Twitter or X, you can have closed captions. And so people can upload a subtitle file that people can turn on or off. And more distributors are using this, which is great, but there's still major distributors that are releasing trailers without access versions. Even the recent announcement of the new A Quiet Place trailer was released without descriptive subtitles, which was hugely frustrating. So it's still, yeah, very much a problem. And I think one way that exhibitors can perhaps, in a small way advocate is just ask when you're in discussions with distributors, asking, do you have trailers with descriptive subtitles as well, or any other asset, because you're demonstrating that demand, demonstrating that you want to provide that. And hopefully some of them will start to think, right, we need to start including this. I'll also answer the AD question that we had earlier. So descriptive subtitles, DS, the intended audience is deaf and hard of hearing people. So it would be text on the screen. And audio description is intended for blind and partially sighted audiences, but there are other people without sight loss that use AD. AD is an audio soundtrack that is integrated with the film's original soundtrack. So it would be describing the movements, the locations, the characters, body and facial expressions, any important relevant visual information that people with sight loss might need to access in a different way to fully experience a film. This is usually in the cinema delivered through headsets. So technically all screenings of a film that has AD can be played with AD because it's not played aloud in the cinema. It's only delivered through the headsets. I hope that makes sense. But if you go on the SideCard website, and once this access directory is released, there's more information about that. Oh,
Thank you, Charlie.
no worries.
So I think that's all the questions. So the last question that we actually have is, how can we get a recording of today's session? So for everyone who registered through Zoom for this session, we'll send the recording or the link to the recording to you. And that will obviously, Charlie's PowerPoint is embedded in that. But if there are other questions, please feel free to email info@filmhubscotland.com, and we'll try to answer all those questions in consultation with Charlie. As Charlie's mentioned, the access directory, which she's written, is very comprehensive and will be shortly available from your Film Hub. And we're just doing final edits on that document.
Yeah, thank you. And we are going to be doing a second webinar of the series, hopefully in late April, and that session will focus on intersectionality within film exhibition, and there'll be invited speakers, which will be confirmed soon, and that will be discussing intersectional barriers that face audiences. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. It was really wonderful I could go on and on about this, but thank you so much for everyone that joined.
Thank you so much, Charlie, and thank you to Gail, who has provided captions throughout.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.